Okay, so today what we're going to be talking about is the role or lack thereof of the author in interpretation. So what I would like you guys to do first, before we get started talking about this stuff, is just take a few minutes and try to get your thoughts about this on paper, right? To what extent do you think the author's intentions and/or biography should guide our interpretation of the text? And as usual, right, no time pressure here, just take your time and we'll discuss when everybody's done. Okay, those who are still writing, take another 2 minutes, try to get your thoughts in order. Those who are finished, look over what you've got, make sure you've said what you want to say. Okay, so who wants to start us off here? Volunteers? Yeah, mine.
So I said the author's intentions should play a bigger role in how we interpret what we read, because I believe authors write with a set purpose in mind, like they have a set intention, like what they want us to get from it. So like if we come up with our own interpretation, that kind of defeats the purpose, well, the author's purpose. So our interpretations may not be as accurate to it like the author wants. So it's kind of like it defeats the purpose.
Okay, who else? Yeah, Sabrina.
I said something kind of similar, that author's intention is, I feel like it should be a big factor into interpretation, but regardless, it's a reader's interpretation is going to be based on their experiences and their opinions. So you can read with that intention, but you're still kind of going to base it off your own advice.
Okay, so while you may keep the author's intention in mind, you're not locked into reading the text the way the author intended you to do so. Okay. Next, yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
I was sort of neutral, like the interpretation of the text. The interpretation of the text depends entirely on the reader, but it kind of defeats the purpose of the author, because people like to become authors because they want the readers to know their points of view. So it just, like, then again, a basic highlight of the author's past should be enough depending on what the author is trying to say. Otherwise, it completely depends on the reader.
Okay, so would you say that, those of you who've spoken so far, would you say that you need to know something about the author in order to understand the text?
I mean, not necessarily know anything about the author, but know what they're trying to say.
Okay, so at least have knowledge of their intent. All right.
Yeah.
Nick, go ahead.
I kind of middle grounded.
Okay.
I do feel that interpretation and intention are just the fact that they're two entirely different things.
Okay.
And when you bring intention into interpretation, it's no longer an original interpretation. It's more of a mixture of what you think and what the author thinks is what is important.
Okay.
The quote from what I said, the only time the author's intention should be mentioned is when the origin of the work is in question. Because if you can't understand a certain work and it needs some sort of understanding of the author's intention, the whole intention is botched by that point if the work can't support it on its own. But at the same time, knowing that intention will help you understand and interpret certain art.
Okay, so at least sort of gives you a standard by which to measure what you're reading. All right, Sean, go ahead.
Kind of said it. It kind of circumstances.
Mhm.
Definitely like creators, like authors, maybe creators of, franchises, as you'd say.
Sure.
Can't deviate, like the author's intent should take full focus other than you interpreting what you think the author tried to put out.
Okay. So, yeah, and I think when we talk about authorial intent, right, then we're talking about one of the earliest ways in which people tried to measure literature in a more or less scientific fashion, right? One of the big problems for early scholars of literature is that we're dealing with something that's essentially subjective, and they needed some kind of standard of interpretation, right? So one of the standards that they hit on was how successfully does this meet the author's intentions? Can we see any difficulties or problems with using intent as a standard, though? Are there any potential difficulties or pitfalls with using the author's intention as a standard?
Some people may be like offended by it, or what they think the intention is and what they offended by.
Okay, yeah, and in some cases, the author's intent is to offend, right? There's a 17th century poet, the Earl of Rochester, who basically, he wrote really clever but filthy verses that were designed to offend and upset the sensibilities of moralists while entertaining the courtly circle that he moved in, right? So yeah, sometimes people are trying to offend, sometimes it is the intent, right? What else is, like, on a more basic level, though, what's the problem sometimes with intention? Say you've got a work, for example, in which the author is unknown. If you look at something like Beowulf, right? Or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, do we know anything about the authors of those works? So the author's intention is not always available to us, right? And even when we're talking about authors who have, who are identified with particular works, right? It's relatively rare that they actually sit down and spell out exactly what they were trying to accomplish here, right? A rare example would be Edgar Allan Poe's essays on the composition of The Raven, right? He spells out for his audience exactly what it was he was trying to accomplish in the poem and what different metrical arrangements he uses in the poem to try to get there. And choice of subject, things like that, like all of the effects that he was going for. Now, one thing to note about that is that judging by what Poe says he was going for, the poem is a failure, because it doesn't actually do any of the things that he says it does. But most of the time, you're not even going to get that much from the author, right? The author puts the work out into the world and rarely actually comments on what their intent was in writing it, right? What else happens if we are guided sort of too closely by authorial intention? How many possible interpretations are there of a work if that's the standard, that's the guide?
The one would be like close-minded.
Yeah, you kind of lock yourself into one right or wrong answer, right? Right, you're either correct or you're incorrect, no matter what your other evidence is, right? So there's no room for ambiguity. Anything else we can think of as sort of problematic about authorial intent as a guide, right? And I'm not saying, by the way, that those who think that we should be guided by the author's intent are wrong. What I am is trying to point out the kinds of objections people raise, right, to using intent as your primary guide.
It may affect how we critique a work.
Okay, yeah, it's going to lock us down that narrow path, right? And it also it makes the assumption that authors state their intention in code, right? And that the text is kind of like a riddle that we have to crack. And then once we've cracked the riddle and extracted extracted the answer, right? You crack that walnut and you take a little piece out. Then the job is done, right? So, if that's the case, why would authors encode their message in fiction or poetry and drama rather than just sort of stating flat out what it is they meant, right? Right? Why not just be clear about what it is you're trying to say? The statement you're trying to make is, say, no more nukes, right? Why not just say no more nukes rather than, say, like writing some kind of extended allegory about it, right? And of course, there are potential answers for all of these objections, right? That, for example, perhaps making that no more nukes message more concrete in the form of a story or a play will affect your audience emotionally in ways that simply, like, putting it on a t-shirt or holding up a sign will not. But these are the primary objections that people make to the notion of authorial intent as a guide to interpretation, right? And by and large, since the 1940s or so, authorial intent has not been as important as it was in, say, the 19th century in measuring the success, the value of a particular work or an interpretation of a particular work. Now, the other issue here is biography. What do we get as a positive if we know something about the author's biography?
The origin of the work?
Okay, yeah. If we know something about the author's biography, then this helps us trace their works back to their origin. And so, for example, if we know something about William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, right, then we know some things about their personal collaboration that led to the Lyrical Ballads volume and the their promotion of British Romanticism, right? What else do we get if we know something about the author's biography? Yeah, we can get some sense of how the work relates to its times, right? Anything else?
Sometimes, authors, they'll write about their own lives, but use like a different character for it. So, like, if you know their history, then you kind of like know they're talking about themselves in a way.
Okay, it can help you figure out if say the narrator or the protagonist is a stand-in for the author or is an invented persona, right? Anything else that's valuable about biography? So biography used to be the other standard that scholars used to discuss an author's work, right? So essentially, all creative works were treated as a form of autobiography, right? And what scholars were interested in was whether or not the work lived up to the author's stated intentions and what elements of the author's biography you could see worked into the text. And the biography approach has a lot of the same problems the intentional approach does, right? A lot of the same objections can be raised, right? What do we do with anonymous or unknown authors, right? If all writing is a form of autobiography, then what room is there for creativity or originality? Why not just write a straight autobiography instead of couching it in these other terms, right? So one of the reasons criticism took this particular turn has to do with historical developments in the 18th and 19th centuries, right? And to sort of tip my own hand here. As most of you have probably guessed, right? Especially those of you who've had classes with me before, right? I don't care about the author, right? By and large, in the way I work, the way I interpret texts, the author is of very little interest to me because I'm much more concerned with the historical and economic circumstances that produce a work, right? Now, again, that doesn't mean that is the only way to approach a work. But you'll find other professors in the department, for example, who are interested in the psychological aspects, for example, of an author's work. Even we talked about Harold Bloom in the canon a couple of sessions ago. He had that anxiety of influence theory, right, where maybe the author's biography doesn't matter all that much in Bloom's theory, where the young writer is trying to rewrite the older writer that's the influence. But intention does matter there, right? So yeah, these authorial interpretation methods have not gone away. But yeah, a lot of where they come from is the rise of capitalism in the 18th century. So, if you are a medieval English writer, say, you're Geoffrey Chaucer or the Gawain poet, how do you make money? How did Dante make a living? Any ideas? If you're living in a feudal aristocratic society, pre-capitalist, right? So you're not selling your works on an open market. What are you doing to get paid? Who or what do you attach yourself to?
The aristocrats.
Yeah, you find yourself a rich patron, right? And that patron is going to, at the very least, going to pay your room and board, right? Give you a roof over your head and enough to eat. And in return, you will occasionally churn out, verses about their spectacularly plain spouse, praising that person's beauty. But you will also be given the chance to, work on your own interests, your own stuff, right, and kind of in your off time. So, while Chaucer is churning out reams of verse for his patrons, right, he is also, composing the Canterbury Tales and Troilus and Cressida and the Parliament of Fowls, right, mostly on his off time. But what this system did was it gave the author kind of time, freedom, and leisure to write, right? Of course, the problem was that you had to write in order to please that patron, or else they were going to cut you off. And essentially everything you produce then kind of belongs to that patron and not to you. Now, in the 18th century, the notion of intellectual property first comes into being. And really comes into its own in the early 19th century. Right? So this idea that you can own an idea, right? That if it was your idea, you should be the one who makes money off of it. The American author Washington Irving was a great kind of champion of, early champion of copyright, right? He's better known now for that than for anything he wrote, apart from maybe The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But yeah, prior to this, an author's works were not copyrighted, and essentially could be sort of pirated by anybody, right? You know, published by anybody and just kind of sent out into the world. And the printers would make money on it. The writer wouldn't necessarily see a dime, right? So the notion of the author as this kind of, you know, solitary genius figure churning out manuscripts arises directly from the rise of intellectual property law. Right? Here is the artist who owns this work, who owns these ideas, and gets paid for them, right? Now this dovetails very nicely with Romanticism, and its celebration of the individual imagination. Right, the typical romantic poetic situation is somebody going out for a walk somewhere, observing a thing, ruminating on it for a while, right? Connecting that thing to his or her own thoughts and memories, and then spitting the thing back out transformed, right? So romantic poetry is primarily about individual mental activity. And it's this kind of lingering notion of the artist as perceiving subjects, as imaginative genius, that leads to, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these author-focused theories, right, of creativity. And this focus on the author in scholarship. Now, one of the reasons why people like Wimsatt and Beardsley, and we've already talked a little bit about Wimsatt and Beardsley before, right? One of the reasons that they reject this idea of the author has to do with the school of criticism they're associated with and some of its ideological and artistic biases. Does anybody remember which school of criticism Wimsatt and Beardsley were associated with? And if we run down quickly some of the ideas they were associated with. So today you were to read their essay on the intentional fallacy. Right, they're also known as the formulators of the idea of the effective fallacy. Does anybody remember what the effective fallacy was? What does the word fallacy suggest? Yeah, that it's a wrong-headed idea, right? So the effective fallacy is the notion that the reader's feelings matter in interpretation of the work, right? The intentional fallacy is the notion that the author's intent matters. So essentially what they do is close down two opposite possibilities here, right? They're coming at this problem from two sides. The intentional fallacy suggests that we are wrong to read a text trying to figure out what the author's intent was. And the effective fallacy suggests that we are also wrong to judge a text by the emotional impact it has on readers. So, if we think about this in terms of the categories of criticism we talked about a couple weeks ago, we looked at, say, M.H. Abrams and Wellick and Warren. What two categories of criticism are they closing off here? What do we call theories that are focused primarily on the author? Just remember this little diagram here, right? Work, world, author, audience. What do we call theories that were primarily based on the relationship between the work and the author? Yeah. So this is anti-expressive, right? And what did we call those that were based primarily on effect on the relationship between the audience and the work? Pragmatic, good, yes, thank you, Sabrina. So the effective fallacy is anti-pragmatic. So Wimsatt and Beardsley are coming at texts, right, from an objective perspective, right, that really kind of tries to judge the work solely on its own terms. Right? They're associated with that movement that we call the new criticism. And one of the things that marks the new criticism is that it is almost aggressively anti-romantic. Right? The new critics reject just about anything that smacks of romanticism. And yeah, that is really annoying, isn't it? Well, we've got a couple more weeks of this, so yay. I feel like I'm at the dentist. So, the new critics, following from T.S. Eliot, the modernist poet and critic, do not like either romantic theory or romantic poetry. Right? They're responsible for the relatively low opinion that the Academy has of both into the 1960s, which is when they were kind of controlling the discourse, right? So a lot of their hostility to the author as a measure of meaning comes from a hostility to romanticism and to expressive theories of art generally. Now, around the same time, there's a British philosopher of language by the name of J.L. Austin. And Austin writes a book published in 1955 called How to Do Things with Words. So, the central idea of Austin's theory is that language is not simply descriptive or assertive. Right? Most theories of language prior to Austin suggest that we use language to do essentially two things, right? To describe things and to assert truth or falsehood. Austin adds a third category that he calls the performative utterance. And the performative utterance is a form of speech that actually calls certain conditions into being, right? So a performative utterance is speech that creates or that changes the world in some way, right? So think about a marriage ceremony, right? What happens when the celebrant of the ceremony says, "I now pronounce you married"? Is he merely describing a situation that already exists, or asserting truth or falsehood? What happens when that celebrant says, "I now pronounce you married"? Yeah, your actual legal status changes, right? That utterance changes conditions in the world. You know, if the King of France says, "I declare war on Switzerland," right? This creates a condition of war between France and Switzerland. If your instructor says, "I hereby grant you an A in this class," right? You don't already have an A in this class. The world has changed in that way, right? So performative utterances are speech acts that change the world, that change conditions in the world. And following on Austin, there are some critics who argue that this is essentially the way literature works, right? That every text is a speech act in which the author has perhaps invented a particular set of conditions, but does not necessarily have control over them once they are out in the world. Right? So if you're reading a poem in this way, for example, then the assumption that you're making is that the poem is dramatic, right? And dramatic in the sense that it's an invented scene spoken by an invented character. Even if the speaker in the poem is someone very much like the poet, right? So for example, like in every William Wordsworth poem, the speaker is someone who is virtually identical to William Wordsworth because he can't get out of his own freaking head, right? My apologies. Strong feelings about Wordsworth. But in this case, right, it is usually suggested that the critic distance himself or herself from the author by referring to the speaker in a poem and not the author, right? And by always assuming that the speaker in the poem is an invented character. So let's take a quick look at a poem. Actually, one of the romantic poems that Wimsatt Beardsley and their ilk love so very, very much. So this is a poem by a relatively minor romantic poet by the name of Robert Southey. Southey was popular in his own time, but his reputation has not really survived. This is regarded as pretty much the only good poem the guy ever wrote by contemporary critics. So it's called My Days Among the Dead Are Past. So let's go through the poem together, and I want you to think about the metaphor here. Like, essentially, I want you to think about, like, what place is Southey describing and how can we tell? And what kind of attitude towards the relationship between author and audience is assumed in the poem, right? My days among the dead are past, around me I behold. Where'er these casual eyes are cast, the mighty minds of old. My never-failing friends are they, with whom I converse day by day. With them I take delight in weal and seek relief in woe. And while I understand and feel how much to them I owe, my cheeks have often been bedewed with tears of thoughtful gratitude. My thoughts are with the dead, with them I live in long past years. Their virtues love, their faults condemn, partake their hopes and fears. And from their lessons seek and find instruction with an humble mind. My hopes are with the dead, anon my place with them will be. And I with them shall travel on through all futurity, yet leaving here a name, I trust, that will not perish in the dust. So what's the place he's describing, and who are these dead that he's talking about? God, we just stop with the grinding. Think about it for a minute. If you need to see that last stanza again, also let me know. I'll scroll down. Think about this in terms of romantic ideas of relationships between author and audience. Maybe think of it this way. How can one actually converse with the dead? Is this due to necromancer summoning up spirits?
He's reading their writings.
Yeah, exactly, right? So the dead here are other authors, right? So if that's what he's, so if his days among the dead are past, and around him he beholds the mighty minds of old, where is he in all likelihood? What kind of place is he sitting in? Yeah. This is a library. And what does he seem to get from these mighty minds of old? With them I take delight in weal and seek relief in woe. And while I understand and feel how much to them I owe, my cheeks have often been bedewed with tears of thoughtful gratitude.
Inspiration.
Okay, inspiration. Emotional sustenance, right? And does it seem to be a two-way relationship?
It could be, because he understands what they went through.
Yeah, but he seems to be mostly focused on them, right? the wisdom and he's focused on what he's getting from them, right? My thoughts are with the dead, with them I live in long past years. Their virtues love, their faults condemn, partake their hopes and fears, and from their lessons seek and find instruction with an humble mind, right? So this suggests an attitude that equates author with authority, right? Right, that these authors of the past, these dead minds, right, have something to teach you in the present, and you must be receptive to them, right? And then what's weird about this last stanza here? My hopes are with the dead, anon my place with them shall be, and I with them shall travel on through all futurity, yet leaving here a name, I trust, that will not perish in the dust.
Someday he'll be dead and people will remember him.
Yeah, he's hoping to be one of those dead names on the spine of a book, right, after his own passing, right? Yet leaving here a name I trust that will not perish in the dust. Right? It has so much for hopes and dreams. But didn't quite turn out that way for you, did you? Did it, Robert? But yeah. So yeah, the idea here, right, is the authors, right, the great writers of the past, as these great minds that have wisdom to impart to you, right? So this is pretty much exactly the kind of idea that Wimsatt and Beardsley are reacting against, right? That the great writers of the past are not there simply to teach you particular lessons, that some of them probably didn't even friggin' exist. And that the thing that you need to be examining is the work on its own terms. Now, Roland Barbes, the French philosopher, is coming at a similar idea from a slightly different angle, right? So Wimsatt and Beardsley don't care about the author or the reader, right? Bart is framing his argument a little bit differently. So if we look at the beginning here of The Death of the Author, right? In his story Sarrasine, Balzac, describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes the following sentence. This was woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility. Who is speaking thus? Is it the hero of the story bent on remaining ignorant of the castrato hidden beneath the woman? Is it Balzac the individual, furnished by his personal experience of the philosophy of woman? Is it Balzac the author professing literary ideas on femininity? Is it universal wisdom, romantic psychology? We shall never know, for the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. So does everybody know, by the way, what a castrato is? Because that's kind of important to understanding the passage here. Okay. So a castrato, castratos are important in the history of theater and music. So oftentimes, when a young boy from a family of limited means had a particularly pure boy soprano voice, he would be castrated in childhood so that his voice wouldn't change. And he could then use his voice to continue to make money over the course of his lifetime, right? At the cost of being able to produce children. So castratos often performed female parts in operas, especially in eras in which women were not permitted to go on the stage, right? So the short story that Barbes is describing here, Saracine, is about a young man who falls in love with a castrato who is playing the role of a woman and doesn't realize that the woman he's fallen in love with is a castrato, and then, falls into a kind of sexual panic when he realizes the truth, right? But the point here of the passage, right? The difficulty in this passage that Barbes is speaking of here, right? Is that this is a description of a castrated man dressed as a woman, right? Who is speaking thus? Is it the hero of the story, bent on remaining ignorant of the castrato hidden beneath the woman? Is it Balzac, the individual, furnished by his personal experience of the philosophy? Like, why is it unlikely that this voice is that of the author? What does the author know that the character in the story doesn't?
The gender of the castrato.
Yeah. The author knows the truth about this character, right? And so what Bart is kind of getting at here is like, okay, if the author knows the truth about the character, right, and doesn't express it here, still talks about this character as though the character is a biological woman, then this can't be the authorial voice speaking as the narrator, right? The narrator must be some kind of invented persona that shifts the author off to the side, right? So Barthes' theory of writing in general which is related to a mid-20th century intellectual movement called deconstruction, is that writing doesn't bring us closer to the author. Writing does not connect us with the mind of the author. Rather, writing defers the reader's encounter with the author. It actually distances us from the author and the author's mind and the author's intent. Right? It pushes us further away. No doubt, it has always been that way. As soon as a fact is narrated, no longer with a view to acting directly on reality but intransitively, that is to say, finally outside of any function other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself, this disconnection occurs, the voice loses its origin, the author enters into his own death, writing begins. So essentially, by committing his thoughts to paper, right, the author assures their own irrelevance. Once the thoughts are on paper, you don't need the author anymore. The work is done. The author doesn't have to explain it to you. The author probably isn't available to explain it to you anyway, right? By putting your words on paper, you lose control of them. And you give that control up to the reader, right? If we look at the last page of this, right? The reader, starting from about right here, the reader is the space on which all the quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. So where is Barthes reorienting power of interpretation here? Who matters more, the author or the reader? Yeah. It doesn't matter anymore, according to Barthes' argument, right, who put these words on the page. What matters is where they end up, right? Who receives them and what that person does with them. And this is all kind of based in a system, right? So I mentioned deconstruction a minute ago. Do any of you know anything about deconstruction? Do you remember it from theory class? Deconstruction is actually, it's the basic idea that underlies it is relatively simple, but it's always explained in extremely complex terms with a lot of invented language and things like that. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that it's mostly translated from French, and it just doesn't always translate cleanly into English. But the basic idea behind deconstruction, right, is that language is made up of signs. Right, so a sign consists of the union of a signifier that is some symbol or set of symbols and some concept or object that it signifies, right? So these two things together constitute a sign. Now, the first premise of deconstruction is that the relationship between these two things is completely arbitrary. Right? There's no particularly good reason why we call a four-footed animal that wags its tail and likes to go on walks and has floppy or pointy ears and sniffs other creatures' poo all the time a dog, right? There's no particular reason we call a dog a dog. It's just a kind of like an accident of linguistic history. But on top of that, putting this concept of dog into language defers our encounter with the actual object dog, right? Language actually pushes things away from us. Right? It keeps us further from the actual objects that we're talking about. And that's the basis of what Barth is arguing here, right? That just as language pushes us, putting concepts into language pushes us further away from the things language describes, putting a story or an argument or a poem or whatever into words pushes us further away from the person who did that, right? We're not having a direct encounter with the author. We're having a direct encounter with a set of signs that the author put down on paper. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Because I know some of the Barth in particular is probably a little bit hard to wrap your head around at first. Yeah, Nick.
So with your example of the dog,
Uh-huh.
you say the God, the creator, was the artist that created the dog, but our interpretation of calling it a dog is just our interpretation. Would that be correct in saying that?
Most deconstructionists were Jewish agnostics, so God probably wouldn't enter into the equation. But yeah, the basic problem of the dog here is that calling it a dog or putting it into language at all pushes the actual thing further away from us. That words get between us and things. Any other questions? Okay, then we'll stop there. And so next time we are going to be talking about what? We're going to be talking about metaphor. Yes, we're going to be talking about metaphor. I don't have the Lakoff and Turner reading up on Georgia View yet. That's going to come this afternoon. I just have to make the photocopy and the PDF. So it'll be up by 5 o'clock today. All right, so let's shut down and start getting cleaned up.